Our lifestyle affects the behavior of our very cells and the very cells that are involved in chronic disease progression.
Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible.
I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Dr. Patricia Huston, a physician and public health expert at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Dr. Huston studies how physical inactivity is connected to poor physical health. And today, we talk about the causes and effects of physical inactivity on chronic or long-term diseases. Before we dive into, any of the technical details about the paper, I just really love to hear about your background and how you got interested in researching this topic.
Okay, well, I am a physician, and actually my undergraduate degree was in anthropology, and then I switched into medicine. I was in family medicine and then studied public health. So I work part-time in public health, and I work part-time at the university in the Department of Family Medicine at Ottawa University. And I got interested in this because, it's almost a given in medicine and then even in public life that a healthy lifestyle is good for you and an unhealthy lifestyle is bad for you. And it's linked to chronic diseases like heart disease and stroke and high blood pressure and so on. But when you actually ask someone like, okay, how does that work? You tend to draw a blank. So I became very, very curious about how it actually worked.
So how did we first realize that physical inactivity can affect chronic diseases?
Historically, the studies that have been done to show this have been outcome studies. So they followed populations over lengths of time, and they looked at their lifestyle and they looked at what happened to them. And the people who were physically active had much less heart disease than people who didn't. So they saw the outcome, but that doesn't tell you the mechanism. And now in medicine, you say, well, just because there's an association doesn't mean one causes the other. So then they look at things like what they call a dose response. And what they found was the more physically active you are, the lower the risk you have. And the less physically active you are, the greater the risk you have. So these kind of things started to convince people that physical activity was very critical. And in fact, it's really the number one predictor of longevity is how physically active you are.
I saw in the paper that you mentioned that the end result that we first saw was the role of inflammation. Could you explain the kind of inflammation and the negative effects that can have?
Yes. So there are inflammatory molecules that are called cytokines. And actually, there are inflammatory cytokines, and then there are actually anti-inflammatory cytokines. But what they found was that people who have chronic diseases have elevated levels of these cytokines in their body. And the thing that was really interesting about this is that all chronic diseases now are linked to the state of what they call chronic low-grade inflammation. It's been linked to heart disease. It's been linked to lung disease, liver disease, kidney disease, Alzheimer's. So, all the major organs in your body have been linked to elevated levels of these cytokines. And, Harvard Medical School has this report called Fighting Inflammation. It does give a very good explanation of how this occurs and how a healthy lifestyle actually is known to decrease these cytokines in the body.
So with those basics out of the way, could you talk a little bit more about how you used networks to explain the way we go from inactivity to inflammation?
What the network tries to do is bring a lot of different types of research, different knowledges from different areas together. So basically, first of all, a network analysis is studying the influences of various things to understand complex processes. So you can have single networks, you can have multiple networks, and you can have something called hierarchical networks. So there's a whole hierarchy of influences that are occurring. And the thing I find interesting about networks is that they seem to explain very different types of phenomenon. So from social networks to networks with computers, but then to also explain biological processes. So I developed a hierarchical network with 6 different levels. And I think where I'd begin is saying that lifestyle itself, I considered as a network. And so physical activity, as we've said, is foundational, but it is part of a network of a healthy lifestyle. And so nutrition as well is very important. And then some kind of indicator of psychosocial health. You know, there's also very compelling evidence, for example, that loneliness is a huge risk factor for heart disease and early mortality, for example. And they say it's about the same as obesity and smoking in terms of risk factor. So it has a huge influence. So when you look at lifestyle as a network, so you think, okay, well, what are the interactions? So physical activity, it increases the connectivity of your brain. You're more likely to exercise with people. You have that social aspect. And it also helps in self-regulation. So you're less likely to binge eat, binge drink, do all of these things. In the same way, if you overeat and become obese, you're less likely to get exercise. So there's interactions at a horizontal level among those 3 sort of hallmarks of lifestyle.
Yeah, I can see how asking, is this a good lifestyle, is, more complicated than just measuring one factor like physical activity.
But we have to realize that lifestyle is embedded in this hierarchical network. And so there are things that influence lifestyle. What are the global macroenvironmental influences that we have on lifestyle? And so, for example, with climate change, if there's a flood and we all have to go to a shelter for a couple of weeks, we're not going to have a very healthy lifestyle there. If we were living in Ukraine right now with this war going on, we're not going to have a very healthy lifestyle. During the pandemic, that affected people's lifestyle. There was lots of loneliness and social isolation and all of these things, gyms closed and so on. So there's important macroenvironmental influences on lifestyle. And then there's the social and cultural factors. So we're embedded in a social network that also influences our lifestyle. And there have been studies, for example, that have shown that obese people tend to hang out with obese people. They tend to come from obese families. And so obese people eat with obese people. What that means, though, is that, we wish it was as simple as telling someone, hey, you should just eat a little more healthily. But if you say that to an obese person, but their context is completely different from that, they have to learn how to navigate that new knowledge within that larger social context. And, I know myself, for example, when I had my son and I thought, okay, I don't want to give him concentrated sweets and so on. Well, at Easter time, it is hard to get through Easter without having chocolate. And in fact, I was considered a cruel mother for not giving my son chocolate. It's just important to appreciate that there are these social and cultural networks that we're embedded in that can have huge influences on lifestyle. And so it's not as simple as just saying, hey, you should eat a little healthier.
I guess it's not just you're getting this level of physical exercise that will let you completely understand, what is leading them to have that chronic low-grade inflammation. But also you have to consider other aspects about themselves, like, say, personality, loneliness, nutrition, etc., that might influence their physical exercise. And also you have to consider elements beyond themselves, like your society's holidays or any types of global events, changes that might be going on.
Yes, that's exactly it.
And I assume now you're going to dive a little bit deeper into that person themselves and what's happening in their body.
And what happens, because I make the assertion that our lifestyle affects the behavior of our very cells and the very cells that are involved in chronic disease progression. So the beauty of a network analysis is that it is like a map. And so, I try and follow the map down through these three other layers. So what are those three other layers? So the first one we could call a meso environment. So you've got the large picture, the macro environment. We'll go down to the micro environment, which is where the cells are. But there's this intermediary level called the meso environment. And basically what that is looking at is the reaction that your body has in the immune system and in something called the autonomic nervous system. And then there's also something called neurohormonal system, but we can kind of put that aside because that's kind of going into the weeds. And when you look at the body from an evolutionary perspective, how did we survive? And we survived in part because of our brain, of course, but also our immune system and this autonomic nervous system that sort of evaluates level of threat. So if someone is coming at you with their fist clenched and everything, your body gets ready for fight or flight. If something wonderful happens, you relax and you've got this relaxation response and you kind of restore yourself at the time. So what happens is the immune system, we've often thought of it more in terms of infectious diseases, but it is also very involved in repairing the body after any kind of threat or injury. So, for example, there's something called the macrophage. If it sees a virus or a bacteria, it will actually eat it, sort of like a Pac-Man. It comes along and it just gobbles it up, it processes it, it spits it out into the lymphatic system, and eventually it gets cleared out. But let's say you've had a head injury and you develop a bruise. So you've got all this blood that's come out of the blood vessels and eventually it coagulates and it's just sitting there. Well, the macrophage is what comes along and it gobbles up those dead blood cells and it cleans the whole area, and then sort of reconstruction can begin. So these macrophages are not only involved with infections, but they are involved with repair in the body. The thing is that I call this a network because these systems interact with each other. So, for example, on the macrophages are receptors for adrenaline. And adrenaline is something that gets released when you have this kind of threat response, your sympathetic response. And so those two kind of interact with each other. So what happens is when you eat junk food, for example, there's actually a whole bunch of macrophages lining your gut, and they start to react to this. And they're going, oh, this isn't a very good idea, right? and they start to produce cytokines. And that is how the inflammatory process all begins. Now, in the muscle and with physical activity, your muscles create something called myokines, and these have an anti-inflammatory effect. And so you've got all these sources of potential inflammation and ways to decrease that. And so if when you get regular exercise, your myokines come up, and that sort of helps to balance those inflammatory cytokines. If you eat too much and you become obese, your fat cells start to produce something called adipokines, which again is a source of inflammation. So there's all these competing influences that are in the end going on in the body, and you have to see which one prevails.
I guess it's like what you do, large scale as an individual, that results in certain molecules being produced in many different parts of your body that either will increase inflammation or reduce inflammation.
Yes. And they talk about actually intracellular crosstalk, so that these cells are actually speaking with each other as well. So an analogy might be like this raucous town hall meeting where, some people are for something, some people are against it. But at the end of the day, one voice is going to predominate. And so either chronic disease progression or health maintenance is going to occur.
And based on what you said earlier, like the loudest voices are those cells called macrophages and the muscle cells. Could you give more detail on how they work?
Like I said before, my background is really in the arts and in anthropology and stuff like that. But I had gotten so fascinated reading about this cell behavior. So basically, I think of macrophages and fibrocytes as buddies. They're like cousins. They have a common origin. But what happens is, we had mentioned that the macrophage is involved in repair, and the fibrocyte is involved in repair as well. So part of the healing process of skin is the fibrocytes are creating extra collagen and everything to seal the wound. And the macrophage is taking up all the dead cells, and it creates room for the new growth to occur. So an important thing to note is that inflammation is actually an initial part of the repair process, because these cytokines are also calling other macrophages to come to the area, calling other white cells. It's like, hey guys, we've got a problem. However, it then switches into reconstruction mode, and the new cells come in and so on. What happens in chronic disease progression is when you stay in that initial state of inflammation, you don't flip into the repair phase. And so I sort of think about it as the macrophage getting cranky, and it's like, instead of saying, okay, we've cleaned this up and we don't need to call the troops in anymore, we can start rebuilding. They never get to that. They're like this broken record. And in the same with the fibrocytes, instead of supporting the new growth for the circulation, little vessel formations and so on, they just keep pumping out scar tissue.
And when you explain that, I can start to see the connections that you mentioned with longevity. If it's like the cells have a repair process that they need to get to, but they're not able to get to that.
Yeah, because they get stuck.
Yeah. Our body is very cool, very complicated, but very cool. One thing that's very interesting to me is, let's say until the 1990s, we didn't have much network science in biology. So what new ways can we approach this question now that we have network science that we couldn't do before?
Okay, well, I love that question, because I think that this network analysis has led to understanding how this chronic inflammation happens. So you have to sort of think about it as a horizontal theme that is occurring throughout the body. Whereas our whole approach in medicine has been more to say, look at each chronic disease separately. So you say, you've just had a cardiogram. It shows a bit of heart disease. We're going to have to start you on this heart medication. And then you take a blood glucose and you say, it looks like you're developing diabetes. So we're going to have to put you on this medication. And you know what? Your blood pressure is elevated. We're going to have to put you on a blood pressure medication. So we have treated all of these things in like individual silos. And what has happened is we've been looking at, okay, so what happens to the heart cells? And it's clear that there's something wrong that happens to the heart cells. And we know that chronic diseases remain in the top 10 causes of death, despite the fact that the lion's share of healthcare goes to the treatment of chronic disease. And possibly, and this is my theory, but the reason all these things have almost been for naught, I mean, I think it's improved quality of life, but heart pills do not increase longevity. They take your chest pain away, but they will not extend your lifespan. To support this assertion, what I want to point out is that the macrophage causes inflammation, and the fibrocyte or fibroblast causes fibrosis. It's a connective tissue cell, and it creates more and more connective tissue, and you get stiffer and stiffer, or your heart gets stiffer and stiffer, or your lungs get stiffer and stiffer. And these, in fact, are the two hallmarks of all end-stage chronic disease. So your lungs get inflamed and stiff, your heart gets inflamed and stiff, your liver gets inflamed and stiff, and it's all due to these three cells. So we're not saying that chronic diseases are caused by these processes. There is something that goes wrong in the heart cells. There is something that goes wrong in the lung cells. But the chronic disease progression part of it occurs due to these two cells in the microenvironment that is throughout the body.
If I were to put in an analogy here, it seems like we have, like the body is the most complex Rube Goldberg machine that we know of. And the way that we check that something is wrong is like we're looking at individual outputs that we see. And when we see like this individual output is off, then we try and hammer, one part of the machine and see if the output changes. But what I'm getting is that this network analysis, it's saying that if we properly understand, in this enormously complex machine, what are all the interactions? We can figure out what is the interaction that started the whole mess, and we can focus on addressing that.
Yes and no. Because what this is saying is that there's more than one process going on here. And if we only look at one thing that's going wrong, and another thing that's going wrong here, another thing that's going wrong here, that we forget that there's this whole other layer that's feeding these things going wrong from below.
That makes sense. On top of better understanding disease in general, it seems to me that this also has implications with personalized medicine. And what is the difference in the factors that are influencing this person's disease versus another person's disease?
Yes, and I think personalized medicine, is a good advance because you can either try and have a top-down influence and say, okay, let's finally deal with climate change so that, it won't all affect our health in the end. Or you can do a kind of bottom-up approach, or you can work on lifestyle. And so what personalized medicine allows you to do is to say to the person, like, what would you like to work on? You kind of seem quite stressed out right now. Do you want to work on that piece of it? Because that may be linked to some of the bad eating habits you have. Or would you like to work on physical activity? Or would you like to join a trial where we have this new macrophage modifying drug? And actually, there is the first one that's coming out to do that as a way to decrease inflammation. I think the doctor in the future, the doctors will even say, we can measure it. We can measure your cytokines. We can also measure, what is your state of stress through your autonomic nervous system through something called heart rate variability.
I can definitely see the future looks really bright here. What would you say are the next innovations that are going to come about in this field?
Well, there's all sorts of things that you can do. Actually, I was thinking like one analogy, you're in a neighborhood and there's a beautiful park in the neighborhood, but you notice that, this plant isn't doing very well. And so you start to clear the ground around it so it gets a little sunlight. But then you look and you think, this tree isn't doing very well, but maybe it's all due to something in the soil. So what can be done? There's been some artificial intelligence, machine learning. For example, they've done network analyses of, it's called an interactome. So all the different things that are involved in causing heart disease. And then they look at where a certain cardiac drug interacts with this, what they call an interactome. So there was one cardiac drug called an ACE inhibitor where they said, all the action's over here. It has an effect, in some random spot in the periphery over here. Even though it has a measurable effect and does something, that's really not where the pivotal action is. So first of all, some of this stuff is starting to show what drugs may be more helpful than others. And they talk too about possibly repurposing drugs. So, for example, metformin, which has been used to treat diabetes for decades, it has a number of other effects. And through network analysis, they can show that, hey, actually, this is a pretty good drug. The other thing is, one of the questions about lifestyle is, what is the best combination of lifestyle factors, or which has the most influence? So these questions we don't really know yet. And so there is talk of doing these studies where you use artificial intelligence because you can collect data on thousands of people. You get them to take pictures of all their food, and then that gets analyzed. Then they wear a watch for physical activity, so that gets analyzed. You send them little questionnaires like, how are you feeling right now? And you can amass all that information and then link up with their electronic medical health records to see what happens to them.
Yeah, that would be a nice version of the future. But what would you say are the neglected areas of work in this field?
Yeah, well, the beauty of something like this is that there are a lot of ways that you could contribute in this, multiple hierarchical network. But I think that one of the biggest challenges is actually convincing people to have a healthy lifestyle. It's that social and cultural context that we're embedded in, so that when you start changing your lifestyle, it's like one thing is going to cause other things to go awry, right? And so we need a much better understanding of how to help people, how to support people through lifestyle changes, and just have a broader appreciation. Because one of the things I believe, the downside of these outcome studies that initially showed, hey, if you don't get exercise, you could get heart disease, is it's almost seen like a theoretical risk. Okay, yeah, that may happen. In the meantime, I have 2 jobs to try and pay my mortgage and put my kids through school, and and I don't have time for physical exercise. And so there's these more immediate pressures. And when you weigh that against a theoretical risk, it's sort of like, okay, I'll worry about that later. But people need to understand that, no, how they treat their body and your level of stress is important to your long-term health.
Yeah, I can see how there's a lot of potential to mix and match opportunities. I really do appreciate you walking through this. I don't think I've talked to another biologist that explains things as simply as you do. It's a really important skill. So I really do appreciate, you sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your interest.